Thanks, Jim. My name is Akshat Rathi, and I'm a reporter with Bloomberg News, where I cover climate change and energy. And with me is Lucas Joppa, the Chief Environmental Officer at Microsoft. Now, Microsoft, among the large companies, has set a standard for how you should go about setting a climate plan, especially a net zero plan. And in our conversation today, I'd like to touch upon the framework that Lucas and his team has put together and how they think about the net part of net zero. So, Lucas, maybe we'll start with the idea of carbon debt, which is something that Microsoft has committed to by removing from the atmosphere as much carbon as it has put into the atmosphere through its entire history. Why do that?
Well, that's a great question, first and foremost, I think, and it gets to the heart of what the world needs to do to achieve a net zero carbon economy by 2050. So a little bit of context, back in January of 2020, Microsoft committed to being a carbon negative company and to be carbon negative by 2030. And we do that by reducing our emissions by half or more, and then physically removing the rest from the atmosphere. And I know we'll talk a lot about carbon removal as part of this conversation. So that's by 2030. What we're going to do from 2030 to 2050 is not just then zero out any emissions on a year by year basis, but on top of that, go back in time and remove all of the emissions that were associated with since we were founded in 1975. The reason that we're doing all of that, including the historical emissions removal, or as you call it, the carbon debt, is because if you look at the best available science, if you look at the IPCC's special report on climate change of 1.5, it shows that there really is no credible economic scenario that sees us achieve a net zero carbon economy by 2050, A, without using carbon removal, and B, without an economic overshoot and need to remove historical emissions as well. And so we modeled our commitment basically as a microcosm of what the IPCC is saying the world needs to do in general.
Right. Now, when we think about carbon removal, that's a very specific thing, and we should talk about definitions. But if you are not Microsoft, but just a company which is not as large, doesn't have the staff to be able to think about these issues, you would go and buy a carbon offset. Now, 90 to 95% of the carbon offsets that you can buy in the market today are what could be classed as avoided emissions, where the purchaser is really paying for an activity that may not happen if they pay for that money. So that is protecting forests or building renewable energy plants. Now, these are all important things, but scientifically, they're not really removing carbon dioxide. So you make a distinction between these two and tell us why that's important.
Well, I think it gets to the root of one of the three biggest problems that we have in our path to net zero carbon economy by 2050. I call them the three M's: the measurement, the meaning, the measurement, and the markets behind net zero. We don't have a shared definition of what net zero means at the organizational versus the global level. And part of it is because of this issue that you just raised, this difference between avoided emissions and carbon removal. And so because we don't have that shared definition of what net zero means, it means that we have dysfunctional markets as well. And you mentioned somebody would go and buy a carbon offset and use that to zero out their carbon ledger of their organization's carbon books. And the thing is that not all offsets are created equal. Not all avoided emissions offsets are created equal. And paying somebody to not emit carbon is not the same as removing carbon, but they are sold as the same asset. And that's a problem because it's cheaper to pay somebody not to do something generally than it is to pay somebody to do something. And because of that, we are not accelerating one aspect of the offset market, the carbon removal aspect, anywhere nearly as quickly as we should, because why would an organization, unless they were, extremely committed like Microsoft is, why would an organization go out and pay more for an identical outcome? And that is one of the biggest things that I think that we have to work our way through, is to differentiate the pricing on the asset that's actually being accredited or sold in the quote unquote carbon offset markets.
Right. Now, there's also the aspect where once you do purchase an offset, and whether that's a removal offset or an avoided emissions offset, how do you use that to write off, so to speak, the emissions from your carbon accounting, right? In a removal case, there is a negative happening, and so you can use that on your carbon account. Whereas on an avoided emissions basis, that's not really the case. So how do you credit an account or credit the company for buying those offsets?
Well, I think that's the interesting problem. I would argue that paying somebody to avoid emissions is an important and valuable way that the world is going to reduce its overall emissions. And from an organizational carbon account balancing, you can see how that balances out. It could balance out your books. You take carbon off of somebody's books, you accredit it to yours, and everything's equal. But from a global carbon ledger, there's still carbon going into the atmosphere. That's not net zero. And so we have this logical inconsistency where we're calling things net zero that are still adding carbon into the atmosphere. And so while it works at an organizational level, it doesn't work at a global level. And so we do have a lot of work to do on the accounting side as well to say, hey, apples aren't oranges, and we shouldn't treat them as such. That's not saying that apples aren't valuable and delicious and nutritious, or that oranges aren't the same either, right? But they're different, and we should value them for the different attributes that they both bring to the fight for net zero.
Right. And then the other aspect that comes through, which is scaling these markets, right? We'll need access to, if we do this across the global economic sectors, we're going to need companies to have access to these markets. And that is also a process that is currently not as easy. I mean, maybe you could talk us through how you've done these removal proposals and then told people about them, and what you think should be the kind of market that needs to exist and how easy it should be for people to participate.
Well, it's not easy for people to participate today. Partly that's because the carbon removal market itself is extremely nascent. So the supply of carbon removal is actually very low. Microsoft released an RFP about a year ago for 1 million metric tons of carbon removal that we were seeking. We received almost 1 billion tons of supply, but when we went through that billion, what we realized was the vast majority, in fact, all but 1.5 million was actually avoided emissions, not carbon removal. And so then we ended up purchasing about 1.3 million metric tons, which shows another problem. We purchased almost all of the carbon removal that was offered to us. And so the one thing that I would say is Microsoft enjoys a significant amount of resources. Not every company is Microsoft. Microsoft has the privilege of having a team dedicated to carbon markets and carbon accounting and all of these issues. And we can do these things, but not everybody can. And so we published all of the results of our carbon removal RFP. We're making that as transparent as possible, highlighting the problems, the opportunities ahead. And it's just something that we are all going to have to focus on. And I just hope that the purchasing and the procurement processes that Microsoft's putting out there are actually helpful to everybody that has to do this over the coming years.
Yeah, that's great. I think we're going to hear a lot more about carbon offsets and carbon markets as we try and deal with these nitty-gritty carbon accounting issues, which are absolutely crucial if first companies and then the world has to get to net zero. Now, I want to leave our audiences with an actionable point, and maybe you have one that you'd like to share.
Well, look, this has been a short intervention with me and you in this conversation, but we actually have a much longer, more in-depth session teed up. Actually, my colleague Elizabeth Wilmot, who leads our carbon program at Microsoft, will be leading an entire session dedicated to the carbon markets that we need. What markets do we need, and what processes do we need to put in place to achieve them? And I would highly recommend everybody that's interested in this topic to go check out Elizabeth's session. It's going to be chock full of learnings and a lot of lessons and really good ways, I think, that we'll all be able to work together moving forward to actually mature the markets to what we need.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Lucas.
Thank you.